very much. Lots to think about there. Some issues around perhaps a shift from a sort of absolute understanding of poverty to a more interest in relative poverty, in inequality between countries, within countries, in the case of the middle income countries particularly. Issues around sustainability, thinking about policy in terms of barriers. What do we know about the sort of barriers that need to be overcome in order to make a jump in progress? The floor is now open. We've got 35 minutes for questions. Can I just ask, we are webcasting this. There's about 80-something people listening to this online, so please wait for the microphone before you ask your question, otherwise they won't be able to hear you. And if people can introduce themselves, and if you work for somebody, say who that is, just so people know where you're coming from. I'll take questions in clusters of 3 or so and then come back to the panel every so often. Thank you very much. Okay, 1, 2, 3.
My name's Diane Coyle. I run a small consultancy specialising in new technologies. My questions are for Charles, but they follow on from Patrick's comments. You said that you thought development was to do with technology and ideas, and technology and ideas are really nothing to do with government and the development community. So I wondered what your thought was about that. Secondly, you're arguing that we can't explain growth in any kind of instrumental way, so we can't do anything about it. But growth also is a story of technology and ideas, and so surely ultimately growth and development are linked.
Thank you, Jonathan Glennie from ODI. Excuse me. Following on a little bit from that question, thanks very much. They were really, really interesting presentations. I think Charles's was kind of particularly interesting to me. I thought, fairly revolutionary in a way, the way that you're presenting the last few years especially. And I think it will be very challenging for people who are focusing on growth, which is pretty much the majority of the formal development sector. The standard line is 80% of poverty reduction comes from growth. I have no idea where that figure comes from. I think I do know where it comes from anyway, but I don't know how they put it together is a better way of putting it. And I suppose they might link it to income poverty, and that again is the big the link, and you're challenging that. But I think it's really even much more challenging than that. It challenges people in the development sector that are focusing on social policy, and it challenges people like me who focus a lot on politics and governance, because what, as I understand it, you're implying is that even things like that don't matter much to improvements in quality of life. And really, as the colleague over there said, the most important things you're focusing on are technology and ideas, which I couldn't agree more. And yet it seems incredibly challenging to suggest that movements, the revolutions we've seen don't matter in terms of people's quality of life in general, that the wildly divergent political systems that we've had in the 20th century haven't really mattered for the quality of life of people living there, because ultimately there's this kind of great optimistic spread of technology and ideas.
Thank you. And there was a third question in this group. Andrew.
Thank you. Andrew Shepherd, ODI. I think both speakers emphasised human development, and I think that was a strong point of agreement in the policy conclusions, if you like, from both speakers' presentations. And I suppose that they both therefore provide substance for the case to keep the core of the current MDGs in place post-2015. But I've got a question, particularly for Charles, but Mila might also have something to say on this from the case studies. Is there not a link between quality of life and growth issues provided by looking at revenues, and particularly tax revenues? And I wonder if either of you have done that. Charles, the negative growth countries, has anybody explored what happened to revenues? Because presumably the successes that were achieved there can't all have been down to social change or aid. So there must have been some story around tax revenues, at least at moments during that negative growth experience. Thanks.
Thank you. I had a question which I will throw in here, which was about sustainability, and particularly to Charles, which is a question about whether you think these sort of quite dramatic improvements in technology that have brought these benefits are likely to be sustained. I mean, I think particularly in terms of vaccination as one of the things that has brought the biggest benefits. Well, you know, the drugs companies haven't come up with anything like vaccination recently in terms of improving the quality of life. As far as we know, there's nothing like that in the pipeline. The question is whether you think these are sort of one-off jumps which we're still reaping the benefits from, or whether this is a continuous process and what is coming down the pipeline which is going to be seeing the same kind of transformations. Okay, shall we take those as a cluster, Charles? I think most of them are directed at you, so do you want to have a quick go, and then I'll see if Milo and Patrick have got anything that they want to pick up.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you, Diane. Nice to meet you, as it were. Technologies and ideas not being about government. Well, I think a lot of them are, actually. I mean, especially if you think of health technologies, most of them were financed and actually rolled out by governments. I mean, you know, the vaccination program was with the WHO, but it was also national governments, and those vaccines were, by and large, you know, the research costs of developing them were borne by governments. So, again, with education, most people in school today are in school that is paid for by government, which is there's a quality question which I want to come back to there. But anyway, so I think there is a huge role for government, and growth is a story about technology and ideas. I think growth is a story about institutions, and I suppose institutions are you know, they're a bunch of ideas stuck together, if you will. But I don't think the growth story can be simply about some countries having access to technologies and other countries not having access, just because we do see technology spreading I mean, technologies of a kind that are invented by somebody wearing a lab coat. Those technologies just have spread everywhere. So it's got to be about, you know, there's more, you know, production process systems. You know, Adam Smith went on about the pin factory, and you know, the real thing about the pin factory was having a bunch of people working together, one of them doing the head bit of the pin and the other bit doing the lower down bit of the pin. It wasn't that they had exciting new pin manufacturing technology in particular. There wasn't a new machine. It was that when you had this kind of production process, that speeded things up. So that kind of technology, the institutional technologies, I think are the ones that are really behind increases in GDP per capita, which is how I think you can have both the spread of invented technologies and ideas pretty much everywhere, and yet a concentration of wealth still in a few countries. On 80% of poverty reduction coming from growth, I absolutely believe that if you define poverty as income poverty. I can't argue. I would like to argue, but I can't. I just think that it's a mistake thinking that the only kind of poverty that matters, if you will, is income poverty. So, for example, if you die at the age of 5, you don't get the opportunity to earn income after the age of 5. And I think that's a pretty terrible thing. Not just from the grounds, you know, you don't get to income. It's just, you know, health is a good in its own right. Learning is a good in its own right. And these things are spreading even in places which are income poor. Institutions don't matter to the quality of life. I think they do. One, you know, democracy is an institution, and I think human rights are a terribly important part of the quality of life. I don't think the idea of democracy is an expensive one. So the idea that you have to wait around for the bourgeoisie to read their de Tocqueville before you get a democracy. I mean, I think India has shown it's not. Sorry, there's a large bourgeoisie in India, I know, but you know, India has shown you can do it at a fairly low income. The sort of neo-Marxist-ishy interpretation that it's driven by once you get over a certain income, I think is rubbish. So institutions do matter to the quality of life. Institutions also matter to some of the things I'm talking about in the book, so it's a bit of a cheat. So take education. I mean, yes, there are many more kids in school than there used to be, but a lot of those kids are learning absolutely nothing. And you know, the literacy statistics I use many of them are based on UNESCO data, and UNESCO says if you've been in school for, I think it's 5 years, you are literate. Well, that is just not actually true in many places. So that way the story is a bit too rosy. And I think, you know, when it comes to in particular learning outcomes, there is a more complicated institutional story, and there is a more complicated institutional story when it comes to more complex health conditions as well. So there is a question about sustainability. Can we continue this progress forever without seeing at least institutional change, if not also more money? Maybe not. Having said that, there's still a long way to go with the technologies that we already have out there. So, you know, oral rehydration therapy is dirt cheap. Breastfeeding is, you know, free apart from the time, if you will. Bed nets are not very expensive. If we just roll these out to everybody, we would massively improve health again. And so, you know, there's still space to use existing very simple technologies and to foster demand for those technologies, and that'll make a huge difference all of itself. I don't know what happened to tax revenues in the countries that I mentioned, Andrew, and I'll go and have a look. My bet is the data's awful, but I'll try and find an answer. I do think that again, sort of the important thing is that this stuff is dirt cheap. That actually it doesn't take very much in revenues in order to have quite a dramatic impact on the quality of life if you spend the revenues the right way. Yeah, well, that's back to institutions, isn't it? But you know, apparently we've done better than you might imagine at spending the revenues the right way already, because a country like Niger is, you know, there are a lot fewer babies dying, and some of it has to do with government expenditures on things like vaccination. Yay.
Andrew, you bring up a good point about revenues of a government. I haven't seen anything direct in the case studies, but what I did see was the indirect increase in revenue in Mauritius, for example, from its sugar sector, which it then reinvested into its social services, education, and into developing another export manufacturing sector. And policy lessons for Malawi, for example, would be then to reinvest revenue from its agriculture growth into building its human capital and competitive advantage.
Yep. I mean, just really to add to Charles's comment about technology. I mean, I think he's absolutely right. While the commercialization of technology may be led by the private sector, often the R&D phase of technology development is very heavily dependent on public investment, public regulation, and I think the internet's a pretty good example of that, actually, if we're thinking about technology that subsequently diffused and radically changed people's lives. I think it's also true that a lot of the technologies that can really have a transformative effect on people's well-being are very low cost. You know, mentioned oral rehydration therapy, bed nets. I mean, micronutrients would be another example. There are some really simple things that can be done that have a dramatic effect. What's often more expensive is creating the institutions and running the institutions that can ensure those are rolled out effectively. So, you know, vaccines at unit cost are pretty cheap, but creating a functioning health system and a cold storage chain and a birth registration system that actually enables you to systematically roll out and maintain high levels of vaccination coverage is a lot more challenging, and does come back to the institutional question. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. I should say Patrick needs to leave us a little bit early, so I'm going to open it up to another round of questions. If anyone has a particular question for Patrick, then ask it now. Got 1, 2. You hesitating? 3.
Yes, my name is Nzita. I'm an economist. My question to Patrick is this. Last year, New Scientist published a small article in which the authors say that Africa data are underestimated by more than 30%, or between 30% and 40%. This was last year. So now this year, around probably 3 or 4 weeks ago, in The Economist, Ghana has revised its GDP by 75%. So now my question to you, did you take this into account or not? And to Milo, in terms of case studies here, what I've done, really, I do appreciate it because I've been doing my own research as well in terms of how to interpret data, and there is a lot of biasness against Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Really,
Yes. Yep.
it is catastrophic. So now, one of the things probably has a case study I would prefer would be Botswana.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much.
My name is Peter Matthews from Engineers Against Poverty. It seems to me that there's a subtext to a lot of what has been said today, certainly by Charles, to some extent by Milo. If you accept in principle the picture that's been painted by Charles, and generally I do, I think it's a compelling argument, then we need to understand why. Why is it this picture has come about? And it seems to me that there's a loss of confidence in the idea of progress. Progress, the kind of the idea that emerged from the Enlightenment that's really driven development. I think there's probably a loss of confidence in that. And oddly, it's probably amongst the development community where that loss of confidence is most pronounced, rather than in the private sector or amongst government. It does seem to me that a lot of what is presented as development nowadays by people from development ages and amongst sections of the environmental community is actually very conservative. It seems to be about persuading people to consume less, to travel less, to have less children. If you take that to its logical conclusion, it seems to me that ultimately you'd be trying to change people's psychological disposition to accept what they've got currently and not to aspire to have something more. So the implications for this, it seems, for the post-2015 settlement is what are the forces that are going to shape those kind of outcomes? And I'm concerned that amongst the development community, a lot of what's being promoted is actually deeply conservative, and it's a result of the loss of confidence in progress, I think.
Over to Paul over here. Really, we should have two microphones, shouldn't we?
Thanks. Paul Wafer from DFID. Kenny and Patrick, you both said that those of us in the aid business sometimes worry about attribution to all these success stories and don't really want to sort of tell the truth that it's not always that easy to do. And I'm interested that your case studies, certainly Mauritius and Vietnam, would ask quite difficult questions of the aid business. And maybe the reason why Malawi's got better in the last few years is that the government itself has decided what it wants to do rather than be told by donors. But I'm very interested in the key point about institutions and what your views are, Charles, about how much aid can contribute to strengthening institutions.
Thank you. Now, Patrick, you need to run. So, do you want to go first, and then
Yeah,
step away?
I can go first. I mean, very quickly, is development still an Enlightenment project, or is it now a kind of conservative project about making do with less or making do with what we've currently got? I mean, I think there are both strands of thinking at play in the development sector. I think there is a real question about which hasn't really come up today, and it's interesting. Probably 2 years ago it would have come up about climate and whether climate poses a fundamental threat to this very optimistic kind of model of progress, and whether kind of the current model of progress is ecologically sustainable. So I think just to throw it out as a question there, but I think be interesting to hear what Charles's thoughts on that are. Question about aid and institution building. I mean, I think there are some very specific examples. Some of the examples DFID's been involved in, where you could say, yeah, DFID's played aid has played quite a significant role in institution building. Some of the work with the revenue authority in Rwanda would be, I think, a good example of how, in some very concrete ways, institutions have been built that have enabled a country to help to pursue its own development objectives. But I think the deeper institutional issues about values and how those kind of get norms and how those get structurally kind of embodied in institutions. I think that's a much more complicated question. I'm not sure that aid has very much bearing on that, at least in the short term.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Should we reverse the order? Milo, you go next, and then Charles.
Great. I'll start with Paul's question. There's a large research project here at ODI that is looking at aid institutions and governance, run by David Booth, and they're addressing this question about how aid can contribute to building institutions. And one of the conclusions that I've seen is that from that work is that there isn't much data or knowledge about that besides working with the grain, which is quite a broad idea. But that would be David Booth's, I think, answer. That would be a question to ask David Booth. In terms of Zita's question, there are 24 case studies on progress on the website, which you can see up there. So if you would like to look at other ones across education, health, agriculture, social protection, there are a whole lot that you can access. And in terms of the data being biased against Africa, I think that's the way the MDGs were constructed. They were intended to be global indicators, and they looked at the trend of progress the 15 years, 25 years before 1990, and then projected that until 2015. And so Asia at that point was progressing quite quickly, whereas Africa wasn't progressing so quickly. So if you were to apply those trends to, if you were to look at the trends in Africa, then they might be progressing much faster or better according to the MDGs than Asian countries, because Africa would have increased its rate of progress, whereas Asia would have decreased its rate of progress after 1990. That might be one of the reasons why it's biased against Africa. And in terms of the loss of confidence on progress, I hope that this project is challenging that through these case studies.
Sure.
I think then we'll have time for one more round.
Okay, I'll be quick. Just on the data being awful, I used to have in the middle of a presentation 6-ish slides that each one word per slide. The data is awful. The answer, I mean, the broader response is the data is awful, but it's not that bad. So the rates of progress we're seeing are so large that it's not the data. And actually, there are reasons to think that we're underestimating the rate of progress. As you say, Ghana just got a lot richer. But they're also, historically, infant mortality data, for example, came from basically surveying hospitals, which missed most of the infant mortality. Now we do a slightly better job. We survey people. We don't catch all of it, but we catch more of it. So if anything, as the data has improved over time, that has suggested a slower rate of progress than has actually been happening. So the picture could be even better. Who knows? Anyway, on the loss of confidence, I do think that the needed debate about climate maybe this is one of the cloudy bits of what is largely a silver lining, that there is this important discussion going on about climate. I don't believe that the studies we have to date on, for instance, what will happen to malaria rates because of climate change, if you compare them to what people expect to happen to malaria because of actions against malaria, they look the climate change impacts actually look smaller. So it's not that climate change single-handedly is likely to destroy progress in these indicators. Which is not to say we shouldn't deal with climate change. We should. I'm just saying that the rates of progress are so impressive that even something as grim as climate change single-handedly wouldn't knock us off progress in many of these areas. But just think how much better we could do if we also dealt with climate change. So again, I don't mean to downplay the threat. I do wonder if familiarity breeds contempt is part of the problem. If you work in development, you spend so much time, being frustrated at the front line, as it were. You do miss the bigger picture, and I wonder if that's part of it. And I think that would be a shame because again, I think there has been this progress, and some of that progress, not all of it, but some of it, has been to do with the hard effort of people in the development community, and they ought to be, some of them at least, ought to be patting themselves on the back. Institutions of aid, yes, sometimes, but I guess we know we can't be brilliant at it, right? I mean, just sort of as a general rule, it can't always go well. We've been doing it too long, and there's signs of slow progress in many areas. On the other hand, clearly there are cases. I didn't know this one about the Rwanda Tax Authority. Clearly there are cases where with the right environment of the client really wants it, and we're providing the right kind of advice. It can all be wonderful. So I wouldn't give up.
Thank you. Now we've got. Are we getting any questions in from? No. Okay. We've got time for one more quick round of questions, I think, and then we'll sum up. So let me take one over here. Two. Any more? Okay, in that case, you can have another go.
Thank you. Stephanie Stewart from Handicap International. I'm interested in the historical perspective which Charles has put on the issues relating to development, and particularly in terms of what NGOs see as their own role. I think that's evolved from a purely service delivery, perhaps, view in the 19th century, when we started looking at those stats, into one which has got a larger component of advocacy, and thinking about the way in which advocacy might feed into the ideas part of the element of change. I'm interested in sort of how you reflect on that aspect of the NGO's roles in the future, and also about the given that often when we're, or always when we're acting, we have to account for the effects of our work. How we might do that, because the statistics become a whole lot more difficult if you're not dealing with countable items.
Mm-hmm. Do you want? Well, then we'll have Andrew next, and then bring the mic over here.
Thank you, and thanks for the second chance. I'm intrigued by the uniformity of the improvements that Charles was talking about, and Patrick was also mentioning, and linking it to one of Milo's conclusions about the need for policy continuity, and also linking it to various questions about, whether aid plays any useful role in all of this. I would have thought that one explanation for that uniformity of positive results, often in unexpected circumstances, would be the very powerful child survival revolution led by UNICEF from the 1980s, and involving not only Save the Children Fund and other international NGOs, but cross-state civil society coalitions, well organized in many countries across the world, even in countries with poor governance, and difficult politics and so on. UNICEF was there in all of them. I speak with a slightly vested interest in the sense that I was part of UNICEF in the 1980s, but it was a very powerful movement, and I suspect it underlies a lot of the improvements between the 1990s and today in the human development indicators that we've seen. And that ought to give the development industry some hope that it can contribute, and also to raise a big question about, where is the next sort of major revolution that can be supported across countries in the way that the child survival revolution was supported and effective. Thanks.
Thank you. And last word over here.
My name is Chris Heymans. I'm an independent consultant that's worked mostly with the World Bank and DFID recently. I think that my sense is that in the development industry, the institutional story is increasingly accepted, but that international agencies, especially public sector ones, like the bank and DFID, the bilateral donors, there are limits to the extent to which they can become political, and the changes that one requires in most countries would be they are always highly political. I would just like to have your thoughts about how you think one deals with that, and to what extent you think the World Bank, for example, has managed to start engaging with the political environment.
Thank you very much. Right, can we try to answer those questions and also say anything else you want to say? All in maybe 3 minutes between you. So Milo, do you want to start?
I think most questions were directed to you, weren't they? And I'm not very familiar with the child survival revolution. I can't address that question. But I would like to send my thanks out to Kate Bird, who is a co-author on all these case studies, and to Lisbeth Steer, who's leading on this project.
Thank you. Charles, over to you.
So I'm on leave from the World Bank, but I was in the World Bank for a long time. And of course, as with most World Bank people, I thought that the only development worth doing was happening in the World Bank. I'm increasingly realising how wrong that was. And the UNICEF story is one of many reasons why. Actually, my respect for the WHO has shot up in the course of writing this book as well. I'm not saying they're perfect, but they really have been behind some impressive moves. And I think you're right. I hope there's another low-hanging fruit out there when it comes to how we make progress in getting these existing technologies further out. And I admit I'm not 100% sure we have one. I do think that things like conditional cash transfers being rolled out further may be a help, and they've been rolled out in some places that are very much fragile states like Yemen. So there's maybe hope there. On the idea of NGOs moving from service delivery to advocacy, I understand why it happened, and I think it's a good thing, basically, I guess. It does make it harder to account for the role that a particular NGO has played. However, while I'm a huge fan of randomized trials, they only work in a very particular part of the development process to tell you who's done what. And a lot of the big questions in development are not randomizable. And so I think we've all got to get used to the fact that actually we'll never really know how much it was us as opposed to something else, and we'll just have to live with orders of magnitude and go on regardless. The fact that there has been overall progress, I think, is a sign that there's kind of enough good news to go round, if you will, that we can all take a bit of credit, and we won't necessarily have over-credited. Finally, on institutions, including the World Bank, doing more on politics. Well, it's always been a political endeavour, hasn't it? So just because the World Bank rightly has not actually supported one political party over another in a country, it is suggested a lot of policies, as has DFID, as has pretty much every other agency, suggested a lot of policies that one party agrees with and another doesn't. And it's been reasonably happy to do that. So I don't think the World Bank would do very well at really trying to get into the political economy game. Partially, there aren't very many good political economists at the World Bank, and I can't speak for DFID, but I'd be cautious with DFID too. And if I was a Foreign Office, I'd be petrified of DFID too, trying to get into that role. So there are going to be limits, but there are things that are just basically broadly good things that we ought to do more of, like transparency. And if there's more transparency, that will have political outcomes. But kind of everybody ought to be in favour of more transparency. So in areas like that, I think there is a role for DFID, the World Bank, everybody else to be pushing harder. So there's always gonna be this slightly murky line between what aid agencies are comfortable involving themselves in and what they're not. But I think there's enough murk that actually they can do a lot of good, if that's the right way around of putting it. Anyway, so there's hope.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I think somebody asked whether we're losing faith in the idea of progress, and I think what this discussion has said to me is that we're not necessarily losing faith in the idea that progress can happen. What perhaps we're slightly less certain about now than perhaps the Victorians were is what we can do to bring it about. That simply because we know more, we understand more how complicated things are, it becomes harder and harder to say this is the answer. This is, as you say, the magic bullet, and we know much better now that there aren't magic bullets. The difficulty that we all face is kind of reconciling our understanding of complexity with our need to act. Somehow you have to find your way through that thicket of we know too much almost, and decide what the priorities should be for action in what context and what the limits are of what all us as different actors in different relationships to the process can actually do. And I think hopefully this kind of process and the book and the different work that we're all engaged in can start to disentangle those things. Let's understand what's happening and celebrate it. Let's also try to step back from that and say, given all of this complexity, what can we actually do? And I think in that spirit, this has been a great conversation. So thank you all very much. Thanks to the speakers. And the next event in this series will be on the new challenges and for post-2015 posed by urbanisation, which will be next Friday afternoon at 3:30.